a black magic ritual, which is the sacrifice of a lion. They remove the lion's skin and put it on her, along with Ernesto Zedillo's photograph. And supposedly, it's based on this that she is saved. Not just that, but she also gains more power.
Mexico is a country with a long list of criminal acts that go unpunished, from forced disappearances to mass killings. It seems that real life is much more frightening than any paranormal story, where the living are scarier than the dead. However, there are stories like the one I'm going to tell you today that would leave many people pale. And that's because there's a case involving witches, seers, sacrifices, and ghosts, and they all have one thing in common: the politicians of Mexico.
I believe it traces back to the origin of humanity and relates to power. Since the Romans, all cultures have had this relationship.
Various figures in the political sphere in Mexico have established ties with individuals connected to esoteric practices, such as witchcraft, shamanism, seeking protection, or an easier way to access power. These figures of the occult are a silent and sometimes even decisive influence over politicians of all eras. Not only in their personal paths, but they have also exercised their rule, supported by spiritual advisors who had the final say.
Who have been very important for humanity and for Mexico.
Among so many politicians who have turned to esotericism, there is the figure or one of the most perverse and corrupt figures. And I'm referring to Elba Esther Gordillo, former leader of the National Union of Education Workers. Her life has been marked by excessive luxury, immeasurable power, and her dark passion for the mystical. Many say this has been the reason for her rise to the top. But what did Elba Esther do to reach the top of power? The truth of the facts surpasses fiction, and let me tell you about this woman. Elba was born on February 6, 1945 in Chiapas to a half-indigenous family. After her father died, she escaped an abusive household and relocated to the state of Mexico, enduring a difficult childhood. With almost nothing but the clothes she was wearing, but with the dream of becoming someone, things started to get better when she got married at a very young age. Her husband helped her get into teaching. However, reality would hit her again because her husband lost his life just a few years after they got married, even though she herself donated a kidney to him in an effort to save his life.
He knows he enjoys great prestige because of his cleverness and the flexibility of the positions he grants.
Her close ones considered her not very intelligent. However, this was not an obstacle, and I disagree with the idea that she is not very intelligent. And after being left alone, Elba became a political animal who acted instinctively and was always surrounded by a team of advisors. Most of them young, very well prepared, who have somehow propelled her in her political career.
The lady stalks, watches, and predicts the next moves.
There was no need to know her bank accounts to realize she was very well off financially. La Maestra flaunted her power whenever she could. She was a political figure who knew how to wield economic power, how to invest it, giving out benefits, gifts, or promoting the careers of writers, politicians, governors, and even journalists. She treated them very well because she knew that at some point they would speak well of her.
On one occasion, to buy favors or support, she invited more than 100 members of the executive committee on a Caribbean cruise with all expenses paid.
In 2005, she changed the union into the New Alliance Party, an electoral structure. When the National Action Party members arrived, with Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón, another pair of corrupt politicians, she negotiated positions of power and became the richest female politician in this country, and also the most powerful. So, over the course of 24 years, La Maestra, which by the way is a nickname, because of her long career and leadership in the National Union of Education Workers, she weaves a network of power based on favors.
She gave away 59 Hummer trucks to the sectional leaders of the union.
In 2006, she was the first to raise Felipe Calderón's hand in victory, even before the Electoral Tribunal announced the result.
The teacher has survived for almost 20 years. And not only that, but regardless of the political transition, she has gained even more power.
She came to have so much power that, just to give you an idea, she could appoint or remove governors, mayors as well, and legislators. She could even promote presidential candidacies like those of Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón. But Elba Esther's power also had another side that nobody imagined, one that went beyond political and economic power. And this is where witchcraft comes in.
Gordillo had a secret passion.
Apparently, Elba Esther was a frequent advisor to the First Ladies of Mexico, but she also advised Marta Sahagun on witchcraft matters, first spokesperson and later second wife of then-President Vicente Fox. Apparently, Marta resorted to enchantments and spells performed by Elba Esther so that Fox would marry her, and later to make him submit to her wishes and whims. The mixture for this binding included pills and potions, which served her in her thirst for power or her desire for power.
La Maestra has always enjoyed the realm of sorcery and witchcraft. She has her team of advisors, a team of political advisors, very strong, very important.
According to those who know her, Elba Esther has been interested in witchcraft and the esoteric since she was very young. They even describe it as one of her greatest passions, a power that would have driven her professionally.
Gordillo believed that with the esoteric she could achieve what money couldn't buy.
Yes, she performed rituals, some to eliminate enemies and others to gain spaces of power.
Her preference was the black cult, which upon reaching the national leadership of the National Union of Education Workers led her to associate with various Cuban santeros. So, for several years, she practiced santeria, but she left it because she had reached a level that required the use of certain necklaces, shaving her head, and wearing turbans in order to avoid failing in the rituals. If she didn't do it, her powers would supposedly start to fail since she wouldn't be acting in a committed way. Because of this, she had to abandon this practice to avoid being publicly exposed for her hidden profession. However, she didn't give up her interest in the dark path. She began to take an interest in voodoo and to worship figures that required less commitment.
Listen, La Maestra is not only politically powerful, but also in esotericism.
That was how the most disturbing and extreme ritual this woman ever participated in took place.
Rulers, the powerful, are always on this line of decision-making where life and death are at stake. And they always need what they sometimes lack, which is confidence.
The author Jose Gil Olmos recounted in one of the chapters of his book, The Sorcerers of Power, that when Ernesto Zedillo assumed the presidency of Mexico in 1994, the president planned to grant an audience to Elba Esther Gordillo, who at that time had only been leading the Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación for 5 years. In other words, the National Union of Education Workers.
When people lack confidence and a sense of security, they often turn to the esoteric world. And those are the shamans, witches, sorcerers, magicians, all these tribes, so to speak, also historical.
Terrified by this, the then union leader, who already had a strong connection with Santeria, told her closest collaborators that they would all make an emergency trip to Africa. This would become one of the most shocking and disturbing events of her life.
She consults her political advisors, who tell her it's very difficult to do. But her spiritual advisors give her the solution. And the solution was a trip to Africa.
Gordillo first went to Morocco, where a shell reader gave her precise instructions about where, with whom, and what work she should do to avoid bad things happening during her trip to Africa. For that, the teacher carried with her the president's birth chart and photographs of the president from all angles in various sizes.
Following the instructions of El Brujo, the teacher supposedly took a photo of President Zedillo smeared with animal blood and placed it on his chest.
Her next stop would be Nigeria, where a high priest would have to carry out the most dangerous voodoo ritual, the sacrifice of a live lion. The ritual was no small matter, and La Maestra had to pay, as you can imagine, a high monetary cost, about $45,000. But for her, it was just pocket change. Her position of power was much more important, and what she had stolen was much bigger. So, once that exorbitant sum was paid, the sorcerer told the group to come back the next day. Because first he would have to hunt a male lion, which had to meet the following conditions. It had to be sexually active and have completed 70% of its life, but with a full set of teeth. The lion had to be in those conditions because it was believed that all its virtues would be transferred to the applicant.
It's in the skin, so that all that energy, all that courage, that rage, all that strength.
The next day, the former leader arrived with the instructions that El Brujo had given her, without bathing, without letting a single hair fall, and with a change of clothes. Upon arriving at the ritual site, El Brujo outlined the necessary steps. The lion had to suffer and be slaughtered so that it wouldn't die too quickly. Then they would remove its skin. La Maestra would put it on, and El Brujo would begin the ritual to transfer all the animal's energy and courage to her. Then she would bathe in its blood and entrails, and that's exactly what happened. About 10 people started skinning the animal. They stabbed a knife into its eye and collected the blood from this little animal. Then they took Gordillo into a hut made of straw and mud, and without taking off his clothes, they started rubbing the animal's testicles, entrails, and blood on him. They tied the beast's skin to him and used its hooves to draw various symbols. All this while El Brujo performed various chants. The nightmare ritual performed by El Brujo was terrifying and lasted an hour until he collapsed from exhaustion. Then they placed Gordillo on a sort of pedestal. The maestra took a picture of the president, hugged the portrait, and said what she wished for 7 times, then fainted. In total, the ritual lasted about 4 hours. And there was a moment when the then head of the union was about to ruin everything. Apparently, the smell from this dead animal was nauseating and unbearable. However, he endured it until the end, fearing failure and that all would be for naught.
Amid songs and dances that lasted 4 hours, he completed his ritual for the payment of $45,000, although El Brujo told him it would cost him something more.
When the ritual was finally completed, El Brujo took on a mocking attitude and began to laugh at La Maestra and her companions. There was something the shaman hadn't told them, and that was that in exchange for having performed the powerful ritual, they had to give up the life of a loved one. The day after the ritual, Elba Esther Gordillo received a call from the presidency with bad news. The price she paid came quickly, and it was her favorite grandson, Francisco. He broke his neck in the elevator of the apartment where he lived, sadly losing his life. And Elba never imagined this, obviously, but soon after, the consequences would be worse because her other grandchildren were taken away from her. In the end, the ritual cost her a life and her relationship with her family, which shows us that everything in this world has a price. Nothing is free.
Strangely, upon her return to Mexico, President Cedillo called her to propose a political agreement. The achievement made her rely more on occultism to give thanks for the favor she received.
Once they returned to Mexico, the rumor of this ritual began to spread, and many witnessed the results of that work. The audits never happened, and the power of La Maestra not only remained but increased. With this, they were convinced of the leader's reach when it came to witchcraft. That's why many decided to leave the union and distance themselves from her, fearing retaliation.
They say that when Elba Esther Gordillo needed a big favor, she didn't hesitate to call the sitting president of Mexico. The problem was when the president didn't take her call. That's when, according to her close associates, she would turn to esoteric forces.
In contrast, La Maestra Gordillo's extravagance bordered on the limits of obscenity. To amass her fortune and satisfy her taste for shopping and luxury,
Elba Esther had an unimaginable amount of money in her account. One of her guilty pleasures was closing stores just for herself. Well, the then head of the Attorney General's office, Jesus Murillo Karam, said that the authorities detected that between 2009 and 2012, she would have made million-dollar payments to Neiman Marcus stores, a high-end luxury store, for around $3 million. But not in pesos, in dollars, apparently diverted from the teachers' union funds. However, even though La Maestra had a life full of relics and benefits, she also had 10 ailments. A bunch of illnesses. Here they are: viral hepatitis C, kidney failure, high blood pressure, 2 aneurysms in brain arteries, arachnoid fluid sacs, an atrophy in the abdominal muscles, an atrophy in the oblique muscle, diverticulosis, decalcification in the hip, and an injury in the right ankle. Apparently, not everything was perfect, and his dream life was starting to fall apart little by little. Most of the teachers could no longer stand her in the union because she only favored a small group of teachers who were seemingly involved in the fund's misappropriation, while the majority had to survive on meager salaries, in other words, or to put it another way, miserable wages.
You must understand the purpose and use of power.
The iron hand with which he controlled the union was so notorious, as was her fierce personality that she has always been pursued by accusations of corruption and blatant corruption. Many people actually wondered out loud, how was it possible that with a teacher's salary, she could have 2 luxury houses in San Diego in the United States?
the teacher continued to be a splendid woman, giving expensive gifts to politicians and journalists.
She gave men branded ties, tape recorders, and cameras as gifts.
But even though her enemies tried again and again, they were never able to prove anything against the teacher. She seemed immune, untouchable. She would never go to jail. That's what people said because she knew too much about the inner workings of the most powerful politicians, about corruption, and many were afraid she would talk. It seemed like no one would dare to confront her. Until February 26, 2013 arrived, when she was arrested for alleged crimes of organized crime and operations with resources of illicit origin. This occurred during Enrique Peña Nieto's administration. The arrest took place at Toluca Airport upon her return from a trip from San Diego, California. The accusation focused on the embezzlement of funds from the National Union of Education Workers, amounting to approximately 2 billion pesos.
Although some see her as defeated, others say that from prison, La Maestra still pulls the strings of power. Getting ready for the 2018 elections.
After her arrest, Gordillo was transferred to the Santa Marta Acatitla Women's Prison in Mexico City. Later, for health reasons, she was granted house arrest. And finally, on August 8, 2018, before Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador took office as president, a federal court ruled to acquit Elba Esther Gordillo due to the alleged lack of evidence and claims of due process violations. Her release resulted from the blessed corruption in this country. But anyway, after the case was closed, the prosecutor's office returned to La Maestra's 7 bank accounts, 3 properties, 3 cars, and several works of art. And finally, on May 1st, 2019, more than 6 years after the former leader of the National Union of Education Workers fell from grace after being accused of embezzling union funds, he didn't hide his ambitions to become the leader again of the largest union in Latin America with 1.6 million members and to have the political influence he once had, where not even the sitting president dared to say no. But the scene in Mexico has changed significantly since 2013, the year he went to prison. The political parties that welcomed her suffered a drastic decline after the 2018 elections, in which Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, Mexico's first leftist president, was elected. The politician has made it clear that the old mechanisms of imposing union leaders from the state are off the table, and that if anyone wants to lead a union in Mexico, they have to earn it through a direct vote.
Meanwhile, the difficulties faced by the vast majority of Mexican teachers were not, are not, and perhaps never will be the real concerns of Elba Esther Gordillo.
Previously, in the 1990s, this workers' union was an important electoral counterweight that many politicians had to turn to. A circle in which Gordillo practically held a lifelong position and in which all the union's leaderships were built by her. Now, at 80 years old, La Maestra has stayed away from the spotlight. Now there are new corrupt politicians. It's time for others to steal. Who are we kidding? And currently, the Tax Administration Service is demanding that Elba Esther Gordillo pay 20 million pesos for an alleged tax debt. This amount resulted from a tax audit that the authorities consider valid, but Gordillo has tried to challenge it through legal means. Although it is difficult to predict the court's decision, if the Supreme Court finds that the previous ruling was not appropriate, it could order a review or even overturn it. However, this process is still in its early stages and may take several months. And it seems that finally the effect of that black magic ritual has ended for this lady. And she's no longer that powerful woman everyone feared, who got everything with a snap of her fingers. It's well known that when you make wishes to these dark beings, in the end you have to pay the price. The debt has to be collected in the worst possible way.
So she gets scared and asks him, "Why are you touching her?" He says, "It's just that I had never seen in any of my rituals that a person had nothing inside."